The guests filling Belladonna never cared who stood behind the kitchen doors. As long as every plate arrived hot and every loaf of bread tasted perfect. Hidden behind clouds of flour and steam, Olivia Parker had become invisible to the people she fed every day, until one powerful man pushed through the crowded dining room and asked the only question that truly mattered. Who made this bread? The kitchen of the old Italian restaurant was a world of blistering heat, ringing pans, and the rich aroma of garlic, rosemary, and freshly baked focaccia. At its center stood Olivia, a fair-skinned, plus-sized woman with gentle brown eyes and chestnut hair tucked beneath a worn white kitchen scarf. Her chef's jacket bore years of flour stains and tiny burn marks earned through endless hours beside scorching ovens. From before sunrise until long after midnight, her hands never stopped kneading dough, stirring sauces, or rescuing meals from impossible deadlines. Beyond the swinging doors, wealthy diners laughed over expensive wine without ever wondering who transformed simple ingredients into unforgettable memories. To them, the bread simply appeared on the table. But on one unforgettable evening, Raphael, a quiet, sharp-eyed man who had built one of New York's most powerful business empires, tasted a single piece of Olivia's focaccia and with one unexpected question changed both of their lives forever. Rain glazed the narrow streets of Lower Manhattan, turning the evening lights into trembling streaks of gold across the pavement. Inside Belladonna, one of the oldest Italian restaurants in the city, every table was occupied, every wine glass was filled, and no one cared who was standing behind the kitchen doors. The dining room carried the polished dignity of a place that had survived for nearly 60 years. Dark walnut panels covered the walls, framed black and white photographs of fishing villages in Sicily hung beneath brass lamps, and the scent of roasted garlic, tomatoes, and warm olive oil drifted through the air. Wealthy couples spoke softly over candlelight, while businessmen loosened expensive ties and ordered without glancing at the prices. At the center of it all moved Victor Salerno, the restaurant's 58-year-old owner, a broad-waisted man with thinning silver hair, heavy eyelids, and a carefully trimmed mustache that curled slightly above his upper lip. Victor smiled generously at customers who could improve his reputation, but that warmth vanished the moment he entered the kitchen. Years of struggling to keep the family restaurant alive had hardened him, yet success had not made him kinder. It had only taught him how much work he could squeeze from others while giving as little as possible back. Behind the swinging doors, Olivia Parker stood before a long stainless steel counter, pressing her fingertips into a pale sheet of focaccia. She was 28, with fair skin that flushed easily in the heat, soft brown eyes, and thick chestnut hair twisted into a practical knot beneath a white kitchen scarf. Her full, rounded figure made the narrow space between the ovens and prep tables feel even tighter, but she moved with surprising speed and precision. She had learned long ago how to make herself smaller in crowded rooms, how to turn sideways when passing another cook, how to ignore the glances that lingered too long on her body. Her parents had died before she was old enough to grasp how permanent loss could be, and she'd grown up shuffled between distant relatives who fed her but never made her feel wanted. Cooking became the one place she felt certain of herself. Dough didn't mock her appearance. Onions didn't whisper when she entered a room, and a well-balanced sauce never pretended not to notice her. Olivia had arrived before sunrise to prepare bread, stocks, sauces, and fresh pasta. More than 14 hours later, sweat darkened the collar of her chef's jacket, and a dull ache pulsed through her lower back. Still, her hands stayed gentle as she stretched the focaccia dough across the oiled tray. She pressed deep dimples into the surface, drizzled it with olive oil, then scattered sea salt, rosemary, and thin slices of garlic on top. The recipe belonged to her grandmother, the only relative who had ever spoken to her as though her presence were a blessing rather than an obligation. Her grandmother had taught her that focaccia couldn't be rushed. The dough needed time to breathe, rest, and become something greater than flour and water. Olivia sometimes thought people needed that same mercy, though few had ever given it to her. Use less oil, Victor snapped as he entered the kitchen, eyes narrowing at the tray. Do you know how much that bottle costs? Olivia didn't look up immediately. She finished coating the last corner before setting the tray beside the oven. The dough will dry out if I cut it back again. The customers won't know the difference. I will. Victor's mouth tightened. He disliked resistance, especially from employees he believed had nowhere else to go. Your job is to cook what I tell you to cook, not protect your grandmother's sacred traditions. And stop wasting so much flour on the bench. Half of it ends up in the trash. It keeps the dough from tearing. You always have an answer. His gaze traveled over her body with open contempt. You should be grateful I keep you here. Other restaurants want someone they can put in front of customers now and then. You'd scare off half the dining room. The younger cooks fell silent, suddenly fascinated by their cutting boards. Olivia felt the words land in the same bruised place beneath her ribs, where similar words had landed for years. She could have defended herself. She could have reminded Victor that customers came back for dishes she created, that food critics had praised sauces he claimed as his own, and that the kitchen would collapse within a week without her. Instead, she lifted the tray and slid it into the oven. Anger would only give him another excuse to cut her wages, or add another unpaid shift. Table 12 is waiting on the sea bass, she said calmly, turning toward the stove. It'll be ready in 3 minutes. At 7:45, Raphael Balucci entered through the restaurant's side door, without the entourage that usually announced his presence. He was 40, tall enough to make the doorway seem low, with a powerful build hidden beneath a charcoal overcoat and a perfectly fitted black suit. His hair was black, cut short at the sides, and his gray eyes had the cold, watchful stillness of a man who noticed details others missed. A faint shadow of stubble sharpened his jaw, while a narrow scar near his right temple hinted at a life where mistakes had carried real consequences. Raphael rarely raised his voice, and almost never needed to. His silence made men over-explain, and his patience unsettled enemies, who expected anger. Since taking control of the Balucci family, he'd spent years dragging its ports, logistics companies, and hotels toward legitimacy, a decision that earned him both powerful allies and dangerous resentment. He hadn't come to Belladonna for dinner. A shipping executive named Malcolm Reeves waited at a private corner table to discuss a warehouse acquisition near the Brooklyn waterfront. Malcolm was a thin, restless man in his early 50s, with sandy hair, rimless glasses, and a habit of rubbing his thumb against his wedding ring whenever he lied. Raphael noticed the tell within the first 10 minutes. He listened without interrupting while Malcolm exaggerated property values and buried the existence of a zoning dispute. Raphael asked only 3 questions, each precise enough to make the man's confidence crack. By the time their main courses arrived, Malcolm understood the negotiation was already lost. A server placed a basket of warm focaccia between them. Raphael hadn't intended to eat, but the scent stopped him mid-sentence. It wasn't merely rosemary or olive oil. Beneath those familiar aromas was the faintly sweet fragrance of properly fermented dough, the kind his grandmother had once made in the kitchen of a stone house outside Bari. Raphael tore off a small piece. The crust gave way with a quiet crackle, while the inside stayed airy, tender, elastic. The olive oil had settled into the dimples without weighing the bread down, and the salt hit the tongue a beat before the mellow warmth of roasted garlic. He chewed slowly, and for the first time all evening, Malcolm's nervous explanations dropped out of his attention. Raphael took another bite. Memory came without warning. He saw his grandmother's weathered hands folding dough at sunrise, heard her scolding him for stealing bread before it cooled, remembered the last meal she'd made before illness took her strength. Very little could pull him backward in time. He'd trained himself to avoid nostalgia, since it softened judgment, but this bread reached a place he'd sealed away for years. It hadn't been made by someone following measurements out of a restaurant manual. It had been made by someone who understood patience, temperature, texture, restraint, someone who cared about every stage, even knowing the diners would never ask who stood near the oven. Mr. Bellucci, Malcolm said carefully. Raphael set the bread down. The documents you brought are incomplete. I can have my office send tomorrow. Raphael rose from the table. Malcolm immediately stood too. Are we finished for tonight? Instead of walking toward the exit, Raphael crossed the dining room and headed straight for the kitchen doors. Conversation softened as diners recognized him. Victor, who'd been laughing beside the bar, turned pale when he saw where Raphael was headed. He hurried after him, nearly colliding with a server carrying wine. Mr. Bellucci, he called, forcing a smile. Is there a problem with your meal? Raphael pushed through the swinging doors without answering. The kitchen seemed to freeze around him. Knives stopped moving. Pans hung suspended above the flames, and even the dishwasher stared through a cloud of steam. Everyone knew the Bellucci name. They knew enough not to ask why the most powerful man in the city's Italian underworld had walked into their kitchen with an unreadable expression. Victor stepped in behind him, breathless and sweating. Please, whatever's happened, I assure you I'll handle it personally. Raphael's gaze passed over the line cooks, the stacked plates, the open containers, the flour-covered work surfaces. Then he saw Olivia beside the oven, holding a tray of freshly baked focaccia against her chest. Her face was flushed from the heat, and a loose strand of brown hair clung to her cheek. She looked tired, cautious, already braced to accept blame before anyone had even spoken. Raphael recognized that expression instantly. It belonged to people who'd spent too long being punished for problems they hadn't caused. He walked toward her. Olivia's fingers tightened around the tray. She assumed the bread had been too salty, too dark, maybe served too late. Wealthy customers rarely entered the kitchen to offer kindness. They came to demand apologies. Raphael stopped a few feet away and looked directly at her. This bread, he said, voice low and controlled. Did you make it? Olivia glanced briefly at Victor, who was already glaring at her as though warning her not to embarrass him. She lifted her chin and answered with quiet dignity. Yes. For several seconds, Raphael said nothing. Then the severity in his gray eyes softened, and the faintest smile touched the corner of his mouth. It's the finest focaccia I've eaten since my grandmother died. No one moved. Olivia stared at him, unsure whether she'd heard correctly. Compliments usually reached the dining room and stopped there. Victor accepted them. Newspapers printed his name, and customers praised the restaurant's traditions without ever learning who arrived before dawn to keep those traditions alive. Raphael inclined his head to her, not casually, but with genuine respect. Thank you. The gesture stunned the entire kitchen. A man feared by executives, rivals, and politicians had walked into a hot, crowded room simply to acknowledge the woman everyone else overlooked. Olivia felt something shift inside her. Small but unmistakable, like the first rise of dough beneath a clean cloth. For the first time in her life, someone had looked past her body, past her uniform, past the kitchen doors. Someone had seen the value in her hands. In the days after Raphael Bellucci walked into the kitchen, Belladonna looked exactly the same from the street. The brass lamps still glowed beneath the striped awning. Reservations remained fully booked, and Victor Salerno kept greeting wealthy guests as though every dish had passed through his own hands. Yet something inside Olivia had shifted. It was small enough that no one noticed right away, but she felt it each morning as she tied her apron around her waist. Raphael's words hadn't erased years of humiliation, nor magically made the kitchen kinder, but they'd given her proof that Victor's voice wasn't the only one capable of defining her. Whenever doubt returned, she remembered the most powerful man in the room, lowering his head and thanking her. For the first time, she began to wonder whether the problem had never been her lack of value, but the people who benefited from convincing her she had none. That confidence showed up in quiet decisions rather than open rebellion. When Victor ordered the cooks to swap imported olive oil for a cheaper blend, Olivia refused to use it in the focaccia, since the bitter aftertaste would ruin the balance of the dough. When he demanded she cut the resting time to boost output, she rearranged the schedule instead, prepping the first batch before sunrise so the bread could ferment properly without slowing service. She reorganized the refrigerator shelves, labeled sauces by prep time, and built a rotation system that stopped herbs, vegetables, and cheese from spoiling unnoticed in the back. None of these fixes required extra money. They required attention, discipline, and the willingness to think past the next plate leaving the kitchen. Olivia had always had those qualities. Now she stopped hiding them, as though competence were something to apologize for. Victor noticed the change before anyone else, because it threatened the arrangement he'd built around her obedience. He'd grown used to insulting Olivia, watching her lower her eyes, then leaning on her to fix every problem his own carelessness caused. One Thursday morning, he came into the kitchen carrying invoices and found her comparing delivery weights against the supplier list. His broad face darkened when she pointed out that 3 cases of tomatoes had been billed but never delivered. "You're a cook," he said, slapping the papers onto the counter. "Not the accountant. I checked because the inventory came up short," Olivia replied. "We've paid for missing stock 3 times this month. That's none of your concern. It becomes my concern when you tell me to stretch spoiled tomatoes through another service." Victor's cheeks reddened beneath his gray stubble. "You've gotten very bold since Baluchi complimented your bread." Olivia felt a flicker of fear, but she didn't retreat. "The delivery is still wrong." Victor leaned closer, lowering his voice so the other cooks could hear every word without pretending to listen. "Don't mistake one compliment for a future. Men like Raphael Baluchi praise a meal and forget the person who made it before they reach the sidewalk. You still work here because I tolerate your attitude, your slowness, and the amount of space you take up in my kitchen." His eyes moved deliberately over her body. "No respectable restaurant wants a woman your size representing its food. Out there, you wouldn't last a week." The words struck with the precision of an old, familiar weapon. Olivia had heard versions of them from relatives, customers, and employers since adolescence, and part of her still reacted before reason could step in. Her shoulders tightened, heat rose to her face. Yet, this time she also saw the panic underneath Victor's cruelty. He wasn't insulting her because she was useless. He was insulting her because she was becoming aware that she was indispensable. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it kept her from accepting his judgment as truth. She picked up the invoice and put it back in his hand. "Then you should have no trouble replacing me," she said quietly. "But the missing tomatoes still need to be credited." Victor stared at her, stunned by the absence of apology. He muttered a threat about deducting waste from her wages and stormed toward his office, leaving the kitchen suspended in nervous silence. Near the prep sink stood Daniel Ruiz, a 23-year-old junior cook with a lean frame, warm brown skin, and thick black curls that refused to stay under his cap. Daniel had grown up helping in his mother's small Dominican cafe in Queens, and had joined Belladonna hoping to learn classical Italian technique. He admired Olivia because she corrected mistakes without humiliating people, a kindness he'd rarely gotten in professional kitchens. After Victor disappeared, Daniel moved beside her and spoke under his breath. "You know he'd be lost without you." Olivia went back to chopping rosemary, knowing that and being able to leave are 2 different things. Daniel nodded, because he understood more than she'd said. He'd seen Victor withhold overtime pay, change schedules without warning, and remind immigrant workers that complaints could cost them their jobs. "Still," he said, "you sounded like someone who might leave one day." Olivia didn't answer, but the thought stayed with her long after he walked away. Raphael returned the following week. On a quiet Tuesday evening, he came alone, wearing a dark navy suit under a black wool coat, and chose the same corner table, even though no business associate joined him. Victor personally brought the menus, offered wine, and recommended the most expensive dishes. But Raphael closed the menu without looking at it. "Bring me whatever Olivia Parker is preparing tonight," he said. Victor's smile faltered. "Our entire kitchen prepares the menu, Mr. Baluchi. Raphael's gray eyes settled on him with calm precision. Then you understood my request. That evening, Olivia sent out braised short ribs with rosemary polenta, roasted shallots, and a reduced red wine sauce. She expected Raphael to finish and leave, but a server came back with an empty plate and a message asking whether she had a moment. Olivia stepped into the dining room reluctantly, aware of every diner turning to watch her. Raphael stood when she approached, a courtesy so instinctive it unsettled her more than extravagance would have. He asked why the polenta held its shape without turning dense, and she explained how she'd changed the ratio of liquid, rested it before service, and finished it with cheese only after the heat had dropped. Raphael listened without interrupting. His questions were technical, not performative, and for several minutes Olivia forgot to be self-conscious. He returned again 9 days later, then twice the following month. Sometimes he ordered focaccia and soup, other times he asked for whatever dish Olivia felt best represented the kitchen that night. He never lingered unnecessarily, and never entered the kitchen without permission again. But each visit carried the same unmistakable purpose. He wasn't coming because belladonna was fashionable. He was coming because he trusted the person behind the food. Victor understood this and grew more hostile, though he couldn't afford to offend Raphael openly. Instead, he criticized Olivia's plating right after Raphael praised it, complained her portions were too generous, and ordered her to use cheaper cuts of meat while charging customers the same price. Olivia responded by calculating exact yields, trimming losses more carefully, and proving that higher quality ingredients produced less waste and more consistent portions. During Raphael's 4th visit, he found her standing beside the bar after service, with a ledger open beneath the dimmed lights. Most of the staff had gone home, and Olivia was comparing food costs against daily sales, because Victor had accused the kitchen of overspending. Raphael paused before leaving. "You manage the accounts as well." "Only the kitchen figures," she said. "Someone has to know where the money disappears." He moved closer and looked over the neat columns of numbers. Olivia had tracked ingredient prices, prep losses, returned dishes, spoilage, and labor hours. Her calculations showed belladonna wasn't losing money because of pricey olive oil or generous portions. It was losing money because Victor ordered carelessly, failed to rotate inventory, and let favored suppliers overbill him. Raphael studied the pages longer than she expected. "You built this system." "It's not really a system," Olivia said. "It's just a way to see what's happening." "That's what a system is." She looked at him, unsure whether he was teasing her, but his expression stayed serious. He asked how she scheduled cooks during busy weekends, how she decided which dishes could share prep without sacrificing quality, and how she handled inexperienced employees. Olivia answered cautiously at first. Then, with growing confidence, she explained that she paired slower trainees with calm senior cooks rather than the fastest ones, because speed without patience bred fear instead of skill. She described how she tracked which ingredients appeared across multiple dishes, so purchasing could be consolidated, and how she reordered prep sequencing to cut waiting time at the ovens. Raphael listened the way he would have listened to a logistics director explaining port efficiency. To him, the principles felt familiar: flow, waste reduction, accountability, putting the right people in the right positions. "You think beyond the plate," he said. Olivia closed the ledger. A kitchen fails long before the food reaches the table, usually because no one wants to notice the small problems. Raphael glanced toward Victor's office. "And when you notice them, I fix what I can, even when I get no credit." She gave a tired smile. "Credit doesn't keep the refrigerator cold." The answer stayed with him. Raphael had spent years surrounded by executives who claimed achievements loudly and buried mistakes carefully. Olivia did the opposite. She absorbed responsibility, solved problems, and let others take the praise because she believed survival required silence. Each visit revealed another skill Victor had reduced to obedience. She understood cost control without compromising quality, could train nervous employees without breaking their confidence, and held authority without shouting. Raphael had first respected her craftsmanship, but admiration for a single dish was becoming respect for the woman who'd built an entire kitchen around standards no one else bothered to defend. By the end of the month, the staff noticed Olivia no longer bowed her head when Victor walked in. She still followed instructions when they were reasonable and avoided confrontation when it served no purpose, but she pushed back on decisions that hurt the food or exploited the workers. Victor's insults sharpened because they no longer landed the same way. Raphael kept returning, sometimes for only 20 minutes, and each time he asked Olivia something new, not about her appearance, her gratitude, or her willingness to endure, but about her judgment. Their conversations stayed brief and professional, yet Olivia began to look forward to them. They reminded her that her knowledge existed beyond Victor's kitchen, and that someone capable of recognizing power in others had recognized it in her. Raphael, meanwhile, left Belladonna with a growing certainty that Olivia Parker had been placed in a room far smaller than her abilities. He'd known talented chefs, disciplined managers, and brilliant accountants, but rarely found all three instincts in one person. He respected the way she protected quality even when it brought punishment, and he respected even more that she never used cruelty to establish authority over those beneath her. With every visit, he saw less of the overlooked woman Victor tried to diminish, and more of the leader she'd been forced to become in secret. What began with a piece of bread had become something far more significant. Raphael Bellucci was no longer returning simply because Olivia's food reminded him of home. He was returning because each conversation gave him another reason to respect the woman who made it. 3 months passed before Raphael Bellucci returned to Belladonna, and by then winter had tightened its grip on the city. Cold rain struck the restaurant windows, turning the street outside into a blur of umbrellas and headlights, while the kitchen stayed as hot and airless as ever. Olivia had kept working the same punishing hours, but she no longer moved through the room with the defeated caution Victor once counted on. She'd become firmer with suppliers, more protective of the junior cooks, more willing to challenge instructions that hurt the food. That change had made Victor crueler. He cut her breaks, blamed her for shortages she'd documented weeks earlier, and started adding mysterious deductions to her wages under labels like staff meals, lodging assistance, and equipment loss. Olivia knew several charges were fabricated, but Victor kept the records locked in his office and reminded her that the small room above the restaurant, where she'd lived since losing her last apartment, belonged to him. On a stormy Wednesday afternoon, Olivia stood near the bread station, testing the elasticity of a new batch of dough. Daniel Ruiz worked beside her, shaping rolls with hands that had grown faster and more confident under her instruction. The kitchen was gearing up for dinner service when the back door opened and Raphael walked in, carrying a heavy cream-colored sack over one shoulder and a dark glass bottle in his other hand. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a white shirt and black trousers. Rain had darkened his hair and left a thin line of water along the sharp edge of his jaw. 2 men stayed outside in the narrow service corridor, silent and watchful. But Raphael stepped into the kitchen alone. The cooks stopped what they were doing, not from fear this time, but from the instinctive awareness that his presence always shifted the balance of the room. Olivia looked first at his face, then at the sack in his hand. A blue seal was printed across the fabric, marking a small mill outside Palermo, known for producing stone-ground durum flour in limited quantities. The bottle bore no commercial label, only a handwritten year and the name of an olive estate in western Sicily. Olivia had read about that oil in culinary journals, though she'd never seen it outside photographs. It was pressed from an old variety harvested early for its peppery finish and deep green aroma, and a single bottle cost more than Victor allowed her to spend on an entire week of kitchen herbs. For a moment she forgot the noise of the ovens and simply stared. Raphael set the flour on the prep table with deliberate care. "You once said this was the flour you'd use if cost weren't the first concern." Olivia touched the edge of the sack as though it might disappear. "I said that months ago. I remember useful information." Daniel glanced between them, unable to hide his smile. But Victor arrived before Olivia could respond. He pushed through the office door with his waistcoat unbuttoned, his face already flushed with anger. At 58, Victor had perfected the appearance of a respectable restaurateur, but rage stripped away the performance. His thinning silver hair clung to his scalp, his mustache twitched over clenched teeth, and the skin around his heavy eyes reddened as he took in the flour, the oil, and Raphael standing inside what Victor considered his private territory. "What is this?" he demanded. "You can't bring outside ingredients into my kitchen." Raphael turned toward him slowly. "They're a gift to my employee, to Olivia." Victor's gaze hardened. "Then give them to her outside. This is my restaurant, and I won't have anyone walking into my kitchen whenever he pleases." The room went silent enough that the hiss of oil in a distant pan sounded unnaturally loud. Victor's courage came from desperation, not strength. He'd spent months watching Raphael's interest in Olivia grow, and he understood that every conversation threatened the control he'd built through debt and humiliation. Raphael didn't react to the raised voice. He removed his wet overcoat, folded it over the back of a chair, and faced Victor with the same calm attention he used in negotiations. His gray eyes didn't sharpen. They were already focused. "Today I didn't come to eat," Raphael said. Victor gave a bitter laugh. "Then you have no reason to be here." Raphael ignored him and turned toward Olivia. She stood with one flour-dusted hand resting on the table, unsure whether to feel hope or danger. For months she'd imagined leaving Belladonna, but every calculation ran into the same barriers: the room upstairs, the missing wages, the debts Victor claimed she owed, the fear that no one else would hire her. Raphael's expression gave nothing away, yet his voice carried a gravity that seemed to narrow the entire kitchen around them. "I've opened a culinary training academy for Baluchi hospitality," he said. "It will prepare chefs for our hotels, restaurants, and international properties." Olivia's fingers tightened against the table. Baluchi Hospitality operated luxury hotels across several cities, and its kitchens were known for discipline, consistency, and enormous scale. She'd assumed Raphael's visits were personal, maybe even sentimental, but she'd never imagined he'd been evaluating her for something this big. He continued before she could speak. "I need someone to run it, not just someone who can cook, but someone who understands cost, inventory, training, standards, and people." His gaze stayed steady on hers. "I need a person who knows when profit matters and when conscience matters more. You've protected both in this kitchen, even when it cost you." Olivia felt every pair of eyes turn toward her. Daniel's expression held open encouragement. Victor's face had gone pale beneath the anger. She heard the ovens, the rain against the rear window, her own heart beat. "You want me to manage the academy?" she asked. "I want you to build it." The distinction struck deeper than the offer itself. No one had ever asked Olivia to build anything. She'd always been asked to repair, rescue, stretch, endure, and stay grateful. Raphael was offering authority instead of survival. He took one step closer, though he kept a respectful distance. "Will you come with me?" Victor laughed so loudly several cooks flinched. "This is absurd." "She can't leave." Raphael turned his head. "Why not? She owes me money." Victor moved between them as though his body could block the possibility of Olivia's departure. Years of meals, rent for the room upstairs, uniforms, breakages, advances on wages. She signed agreements. "She leaves when I say the balance is cleared." Olivia's hope faltered. Victor had repeated those debts so often. Even she no longer knew where the original figures ended and the invented ones began. "He says I owe nearly $40,000, she said quietly. Victor pointed at her. "You see, she admits it." "I admit that you say it," Olivia replied, though her voice had weakened. Raphael looked toward the kitchen entrance. "Elena." A woman stepped inside carrying a slim black case. Elena Maroney was 46, tall and narrow-shouldered, with olive skin, straight black hair cut precisely at her chin, and dark eyes that missed very little. She served as general counsel for Baluchi Hospitality and had built her reputation dismantling fraudulent contracts used against immigrant and low-wage workers. Her calmness was different from Raphael's. His silence suggested power. Hers suggested every word had already been tested before she spoke it. A childhood spent watching her father lose his construction company to dishonest lenders had made her intolerant of paperwork designed to trap the vulnerable. Elena set the case on the counter and opened it. Inside were copies of payroll records, housing deductions, supplier invoices, employee statements, and photographs of damaged equipment Victor had blamed on workers, months after it had already been broken. "Mr. Salerno," she said, "we've reviewed the documents you required Miss Parker to sign." Victor stared at the files. "You had no right. Several current and former employees provided them voluntarily." Elena lifted one page. "Your housing charges exceed the legal value of the room by more than 4 times. You deducted staff meals on days Miss Parker bought her own food. You classified unpaid overtime as repayment of cash advances that were never issued. You also charged her for commercial kitchen equipment that appears on your insurance claims." Victor's confidence began to crumble. "Those records are incomplete. They're sufficient." Raphael reached into his jacket and set a cashier's check beside the flower. "Even if every claim were legitimate, which they aren't, the full amount is covered." Olivia stared at the check. It was made out to Belladonna for the exact sum Victor had named, though Raphael must have known before entering the kitchen what accusation would be used to hold her back. Victor snatched it off the table, then looked at Elena, as though trying to calculate whether accepting it would help or incriminate him. Elena closed the case. "The payment removes any excuse to restrain Miss Parker." She paused. "It does not end the matter. Evidence of wage theft, falsified deductions, unsafe housing, and labor coercion has already been submitted to the relevant authorities." As if summoned by her words, 2 investigators entered through the rear corridor, accompanied by a uniformed city officer. One investigator, a compact, middle-aged man with a shaved head and a tired but patient expression, identified himself and asked Victor to step into the dining room. The second, a younger woman with copper-colored hair pulled into a tight braid, began photographing the posted schedules and timesheets beside the office door. Victor looked around the kitchen for support, but the employees avoided his eyes. The control he'd maintained through fear vanished in a matter of seconds, leaving him suddenly smaller. "You planned this," he said to Raphael. Raphael's expression stayed unreadable. "I prepared for the truth." Victor was escorted from the kitchen, protesting that every restaurant made deductions and that ungrateful employees had conspired against him. His voice faded past the swinging doors. No one spoke until the sound disappeared entirely. Olivia stood beside the rare flour and olive oil, still unable to grasp how the walls that had confined her for years had opened so quickly. Raphael hadn't arrived with vague encouragement. He'd arrived with an offer, evidence, legal protection, and a way out. He turned back to her. "The decision is still yours." Olivia looked around the kitchen she'd carried for years. She saw Daniel watching her with hope. The oven she'd repaired with her own hands, the counter where Victor had taught her to confuse endurance with loyalty. Then she looked at Raphael, who'd seen not only what she created, but what it had cost her to keep creating it. Her fear hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt like a command. "Yes," she said, "I'll go with you." Raphael inclined his head, accepting the answer with the same respect he'd shown the first night he tasted her bread. Around them, the kitchen stayed hot, crowded, and stunned. But Olivia felt as though she'd taken her first full breath in years. The following morning dawned beneath a pale winter sky, and for the first time in years, Olivia Parker climbed the narrow staircase above Belladonna, without wondering how many more mornings she'd spend inside its faded walls. The small room she'd called home held little more than a narrow iron bed, a wooden wardrobe with one broken door, a chipped mirror, and a single window overlooking the alley where delivery trucks arrived before sunrise. Nearly every object inside had been bought secondhand, yet each carried the memory of years spent believing survival was the highest ambition she was allowed to have. She folded her clothes into one worn suitcase, wrapped her grandmother's handwritten focaccia recipe in a clean kitchen towel, and stood silently in the center of the room. She realized she'd once believed leaving would feel triumphant, but instead, it felt strangely peaceful. Freedom didn't arrive with celebration. It arrived with the quiet certainty that she no longer belonged to the place that had taught her to doubt herself. Before walking out, Olivia returned to the kitchen one last time. The ovens were still cold, and the familiar scent of flour lingered in the air. She untied the white apron she'd worn almost every day for years, smoothing the fabric carefully before placing it on the prep table where countless loaves of bread had begun. Daniel Ruiz had arrived early and watched silently from across the room. His warm brown eyes filled with emotion as he realized what the gesture meant. "You really are leaving," he said softly. Olivia smiled, though tears threatened to appear for the first time since Raphael had made his offer. "I'm only leaving this kitchen," she answered. "I'm not leaving the lessons it taught me." Daniel embraced her briefly before stepping back. "One day," he said with complete sincerity, "every young cook in this city will wish they'd learned from you." Olivia thanked him, picked up her suitcase, and walked out without looking back. She refused to let Belladonna become another prison she carried inside her memory. An hour later, the black sedan carrying Raphael Bellucci stopped before the headquarters of Bellucci Hospitality, a modern stone and glass building overlooking the Hudson River. Olivia stared upward at the elegant structure, its polished facade reflecting the bright winter sunlight. The headquarters served not only the company's hotel division, but also its logistics, conference management, and hospitality operations across several countries. Employees moved confidently through the marble lobby, dressed in tailored suits, greeting one another with practiced professionalism. Olivia instinctively tightened her grip on her suitcase. She'd spent years hiding inside kitchens where no customer could see her. Now she was stepping into a world where executives, investors, and hotel directors held meetings every hour. For a brief moment, the familiar voice Victor had planted returned, whispering that she didn't belong among people like these. Raphael noticed the hesitation before she said anything. "You're looking at the building," he said quietly, instead of the work waiting inside it. Olivia turned toward him. "The building belongs to Bellucci Hospitality," Raphael continued. "The work will belong to you." Those few words settled her far more than empty reassurance could have. Raphael had never complimented her appearance or tried to make her comfortable through pity. Instead, he reminded her of the one thing no one could take from her, her ability. The executive board gathered that afternoon, inside a spacious conference room overlooking the river. Most of Bellucci Hospitality's senior managers had worked alongside Raphael for years and trusted his judgment without question. But even they struggled to understand this appointment. Among them sat Richard Moretti, a 54-year-old regional hotel director with neatly combed silver hair, sharp cheekbones, and decades of experience managing luxury properties across Europe. Richard believed deeply in hierarchy and tradition. He respected discipline, but distrusted unconventional decisions, especially ones that challenged the image he believed luxury hospitality should project. Beside him sat Angela Romano, a 48-year-old operations executive with elegant posture, short black hair streaked with gray, and the composed confidence of someone who'd built her career through relentless competence. Unlike Richard, Angela withheld judgment until she saw results, though she quietly wondered whether an unknown restaurant chef had the experience to oversee an international culinary academy. As Olivia entered beside Raphael, conversations briefly stopped. Several executives glanced at one another before returning polite smiles. No one spoke disrespectfully, yet their expressions carried unmistakable doubt. They saw an unfamiliar woman with a soft, plus-sized figure, dressed in a simple navy business suit, rather than designer clothing. No celebrity chef, no television personality, no internationally recognized restaurant. To many of them, she appeared completely ordinary. Raphael introduced her without hesitation. "This is Olivia Parker. Beginning today, she will oversee the Bellucci Culinary Academy and evaluate the operational standards of every kitchen within Bellucci Hospitality." Richard frowned slightly. "Mr. Bellucci," he said carefully, "her resume appears rather unconventional." "It is," Raphael replied. She's never managed a luxury hotel, no, nor directed multiple executive chefs, no. Richard folded his hands. May I ask why she's qualified? Raphael looked toward Olivia instead of answering himself. Explain. Olivia felt every eye settle on her. Months earlier she would have apologized before speaking. Now she simply walked toward the presentation board and requested copies of purchasing reports from the previous quarter. She studied the numbers for several minutes before quietly pointing out inconsistent inventory costs between properties buying identical ingredients. She noted that 3 hotels paid dramatically different prices for the same flour because procurement had never been centralized. She pointed out that seafood waste exceeded industry averages despite stable occupancy, suggesting inconsistent prep standards rather than supplier issues. She also flagged duplicate purchasing contracts negotiated independently by different hotels, adding unnecessary expense across the company. When she finished, the room had gone completely silent. Richard leaned back slowly. You found all that? In 5 minutes, Olivia answered honestly. The numbers were already telling the story. Raphael simply watched without interrupting. He'd already witnessed this ability inside Belladonna. Now everyone else was seeing it for the first time. Rather than staying behind a desk, Olivia spent the following months traveling constantly between Baluchi hospitality properties. She worked before dawn alongside breakfast cooks, observed lunch service without announcing herself, and stayed through late-night cleaning shifts after guests had gone to sleep. She never introduced herself by title. Instead, she tied on an apron, prepped vegetables beside the youngest employees, and asked questions before giving instructions. She quickly discovered that most kitchens were full of hardworking people trapped inside inefficient systems rather than lacking talent. Instead of blaming them, she started rebuilding those systems from the ground up. Her first major reform targeted food waste. Olivia created standardized prep guides ensuring ingredients bought for one menu could support several others without sacrificing quality. Vegetable scraps became carefully prepared stocks instead of garbage. Bread baked the previous evening turned into premium breadcrumbs, croutons, or traditional Italian salads rather than getting tossed. Purchasing schedules were adjusted to match actual occupancy forecasts instead of optimistic guesses. Within weeks, thousands of dollars in unnecessary waste disappeared, not because employees worked harder, but because someone had finally designed the kitchens intelligently. The second transformation involved food quality. Olivia refused to believe luxury depended on expensive ingredients alone. She personally tested recipes, trimmed unnecessary complexity, insisted on proper fermentation for breads, improved sauce preparation techniques, and standardized tasting procedures before every service. She introduced detailed recipe manuals, so guests got identical quality, regardless of which Baluchi hotel they visited. Soon, customer satisfaction scores began climbing across multiple locations. Returning guests commented not only on elegance, but on warmth, consistency, and authenticity. Olivia's biggest impact, though, came through people rather than recipes. She established structured mentoring programs, pairing experienced chefs with younger employees who lacked confidence. Instead of humiliating mistakes publicly, mentors corrected them privately, while explaining the reasoning behind every technique. Training kitchens became places of learning rather than fear. Young cooks who'd once considered leaving the profession discovered confidence they never knew they had, because Olivia believed people improved faster when respected rather than intimidated. Many quietly admitted they'd never before worked for someone who remembered every employee's name, regardless of position. She also introduced strict sanitation procedures that exceeded legal requirements. Refrigeration temperatures were logged every shift. Cross-contamination protocols became mandatory throughout every property, and cleaning responsibilities were documented with accountability rather than assumption. Inspectors who visited Baluchi Hospitality repeatedly praised the consistency of its kitchens, while insurance claims related to food safety declined dramatically. More importantly, guests trusted the restaurants more than ever, strengthening the reputation Raphael had spent years building as he transformed the Baluchi empire into a respected, legitimate business. Financial reports soon reflected what daily operations already showed. Waste dropped substantially. Ingredient efficiency improved. Staff turnover decreased because employees no longer left hostile workplaces. and guest satisfaction fueled stronger repeat business throughout the hotel chain. Profitability climbed across multiple properties without lowering food quality or cutting staff wages. Executives who'd initially questioned Olivia's appointment now sought her advice before launching new restaurants or renovating existing kitchens. Richard Moretti, once her strongest skeptic, privately admitted during a board meeting that he'd underestimated both her experience and Raphael's judgment. Angela Romano later smiled while reviewing quarterly reports and remarked that the company hadn't merely improved its kitchens, it had transformed its culture. One afternoon, several young chefs gathered outside the Culinary Academy after finishing a training session Olivia had personally taught. They watched her disappear into another kitchen, carrying a clipboard in one hand and a basket of fresh herbs in the other. One apprentice turned toward an older executive and asked, "How does she make every kitchen feel different after only a few hours?" The executive smiled before answering, "Because she doesn't change recipes first. What does she change? The people cooking them." The phrase quietly spread from one hotel to another. Executive chefs repeated it during meetings. Housekeeping staff mentioned it in hallways, and young trainees started using it without knowing where it began. Before long, almost everyone inside Baluchi Hospitality referred to Olivia Parker by a new name, one earned not through authority or publicity, but through the countless lives and kitchens she'd transformed. She had become the heart of Baluchi Hospitality. 1 year later, spring sunlight poured across the wide stone courtyard of the newly completed Baluchi Culinary Academy. The building stood beside the Hudson, like a promise made permanent, its tall windows reflecting the river, its red brick walls softened by climbing ivy and rows of young olive trees. Inside, 12 teaching kitchens gleamed beneath bright copper lights, each equipped with professional ovens, workstations, fermentation rooms, and long wooden tables where students could learn side by side. The air already carried the scent of yeast, roasted garlic, citrus peel, and fresh herbs. For Olivia, those familiar aromas made the grand opening feel less like the beginning of an institution and more like the opening of a door she'd once believed would stay closed forever. She stood in the Academy's central hall, wearing a deep blue dress beneath a white chef's coat embroidered with her name and new title, Executive Director. Her chestnut hair fell in soft waves to her shoulders, instead of being hidden beneath the tight scarves she'd worn at Belladonna, and her fair face carried a calm confidence that no longer vanished when strangers looked at her. She was still the same full-figured woman Victor Salerno had mocked, but she no longer entered a room wondering whether she took up too much space. Around her moved hotel directors, journalists, investors, chefs, employees, and former trainees from across Baluchi Hospitality. Many waited for Olivia's approval before making decisions that affected hundreds of kitchens. The authority she carried didn't come from fear, volume, or expensive clothing. It came from the simple fact that when Olivia entered a failing kitchen, people trusted she'd understand what was wrong and help them fix it. Near the entrance, Daniel Ruiz adjusted the collar of his new chef's jacket, trying not to look overwhelmed. At 24, he remained lean and energetic, with the same unruly black curls and warm brown eyes Olivia remembered from Belladonna. But a year of responsibility had given him greater assurance. After leaving the restaurant during the labor investigation, he'd joined the first Baluchi training program and risen quickly under Olivia's guidance. He now served as an assistant instructor at the academy, specializing in bread and introductory kitchen technique. Daniel greeted incoming students with patience because he remembered exactly what it felt like to be young, nervous, and afraid of being humiliated for making mistakes. When he saw Olivia across the hall, he lifted one hand in a brief salute, and she smiled back with the quiet pride of someone watching a seed grow stronger than expected. The first group of scholarship students waited behind him. Some had come from shelters, underfunded schools, or unstable homes, Others were older women who'd spent years preparing food for families without ever being told their knowledge had professional value. Among them stood Maria Ellis, a 36-year-old single mother with a broad, soft figure, golden brown skin, and thick, dark hair gathered into a low braid. Maria had worked in cafeterias and grocery store kitchens since she was 17, but managers repeatedly kept her away from customer-facing positions because they considered her appearance unsuitable for upscale service. She'd almost ignored the academy's application until her teenage daughter filled it out for her. Now she held her acceptance folder against her chest so tightly, the paper had begun to bend. Olivia recognized the fear in her eyes because it resembled the fear she'd once carried into Raphael's headquarters. "You won't need to prove that you deserve to be in this building," Olivia told her quietly. "You only need to be willing to learn." Maria swallowed and nodded. "I've been cooking for 20 years, but no one has ever called it learning. Then today's a good day to start calling it what it is." The ceremony took place in the Academy's main demonstration hall, where ascending rows of seats faced a marble stage and an open teaching kitchen. More than 300 guests filled the room. Richard Moretti sat in the front row beside Angela Romano, and neither looked doubtful anymore. Richard's silver hair remained perfectly combed, but the rigid skepticism that once shaped his expression had softened into respect. Over the past year, Olivia's systems had improved his hotels more than any costly rebranding campaign could have. Angela, composed as ever in a cream-colored suit, had become Olivia's strongest operational ally. She'd helped translate kitchen reforms into company policy, ensuring fair scheduling, proper training, and sanitation standards stayed protected even when individual managers resisted change. Elena Maroney stood near the side of the stage, holding the Academy's charter documents. Her precise black bob framed a face that rarely revealed emotion, though she watched the scholarship students with unmistakable satisfaction. The labor case against Belladonna had expanded after former employees came forward, leading to restitution orders, fines, and formal investigations into wage theft and unsafe housing. Elena never treated the matter as a personal victory. She believed justice was meaningful only when it changed the conditions that allowed exploitation to happen. For that reason, she'd helped Olivia design the Academy's employment protections so no trainee could be trapped by false debt, withheld wages, or housing controlled by an employer. When Raphael Bellucci entered, the room rose almost instinctively. He wore a black suit with a white shirt and no tie. His dark hair brushed neatly back from the narrow scar at his temple. At 41, he remained imposing, tall, broad-shouldered, with gray eyes that could silence a boardroom without effort. Yet the legalization of the Bellucci empire had changed how the public viewed him. The ports, logistics companies, hotels, and restaurants, once associated with fear, were increasingly known for regulated operations, transparent contracts, and legitimate investment. Raphael still spoke little, and his restraint remained intimidating to those who mistook silence for weakness. Those close to him understood his silence came from discipline. He watched before judging, remembered details others discarded, and rarely offered trust without reason. He paused beside Olivia before stepping onto the stage. "Nervous? More than I was the day I left Belladonna. That day you had one suitcase. Today you have 300 guests watching you." Raphael looked toward the crowded hall. "Most of them are here because of what you built." Olivia lowered her voice. "We built it." He didn't correct her, though both of them understood the distinction. Raphael had provided capital, influence, and protection. Olivia had given the Academy its purpose. Angela opened the ceremony by presenting the results of Bellucci Hospitality's culinary reforms. Food waste had fallen across the company. Guest satisfaction had risen, employee retention had improved, and the hotel kitchens had achieved record profitability without lowering wages or cutting corners on ingredients. The figures earned applause, but Olivia felt most moved when Daniel and the scholarship students were introduced. Those faces represented something no financial chart could measure. They were people who'd spent years being overlooked, underestimated, or used, and who were now being invited to build careers with dignity. Raphael approached the lectern after the applause settled. He rested both hands on its edges and waited until the hall grew completely silent. Public speeches weren't natural to him, and everyone knew it. That made each word carry more weight. The first time I met Olivia Parker, he began, I wasn't looking for an executive. Olivia watched him from the side of the stage. Memory returned with unexpected clarity. The heat of Belladonna's kitchen, the flour on her sleeves, Victor's glare, Raphael standing before her with a piece of bread in his hand. I walked into that kitchen because I wanted to know who had made the focaccia placed on my table, Raphael continued. The dining room was full, the restaurant was successful, yet no one outside the kitchen seemed interested in the person responsible for the quality they were praising. Several guests turned toward Olivia, but she kept her eyes on Raphael. That day, when I entered the kitchen, everyone saw her appearance, he said. Some saw an employee who could be overworked. Some saw a woman they believed should stay hidden from customers. Some saw someone who ought to be grateful for whatever treatment she received. His voice remained calm, but a harder edge entered it. I saw hands capable of feeding an entire company. The hall went still. Olivia felt the words reach the same place his first compliment had touched a year earlier. But this time, they didn't rescue something fragile. They confirmed something she'd learned to believe on her own. Raphael turned toward her. I saw discipline, judgment, conscience. I saw someone who understood that food isn't merely a product, it's responsibility. She understood that cutting costs means nothing if quality, dignity, and trust are destroyed in the process. He looked back at the audience. This academy exists because Olivia Parker refused to become careless, simply because others were careless with her. Applause rose slowly, then filled the entire hall. Olivia didn't cry easily, but emotion tightened her throat as Daniel began clapping from the front row, followed by Maria, Angela, Richard, Elena, and hundreds of others. Raphael stepped away from the lectern and offered Olivia the center of the stage. She approached the microphone and waited for the room to settle. A year ago, speaking before executives had made her palms shake. Now she looked across the audience and saw not judges, but people responsible for deciding what kind of institution the academy would become. This academy will train chefs for Baluchi hospitality, she said. But that's not its only purpose. Behind her, a large screen displayed images of the teaching kitchens, dormitories, childcare rooms, and scholarship facilities. Olivia explained that a substantial portion of the academy's places would be offered free of charge to applicants facing financial hardship. Tuition, uniforms, materials, meals, and temporary housing would be covered. Flexible schedules and child care support would allow single parents and older students to attend. Selection would be based on commitment, ability, and character rather than formal education, physical appearance, age, or previous social status. Then she addressed the promise closest to her heart. We're creating a program specifically for women who've been rejected, hidden, or humiliated because of their appearance, Olivia said. Not because they need pity, but because many of them have ability that employers never let the world see. Maria lowered her head as tears filled her eyes. Around her, other students held their acceptance letters with renewed pride. The kitchen shouldn't be another place where cruelty is mistaken for discipline, Olivia continued. No student here will be taught through humiliation. No employee will be trapped through false debt. No person will be told that their body makes their talent less valuable. We will demand excellence, but we will never demand that someone surrender their dignity to achieve it. When she finished, Raphael joined her beside the ceremonial ribbon stretched across the academy's main entrance. Daniel, Maria, Angela, Richard, and Elena stood with them, representing the many people who'd turned the institution from an idea into a living place. Olivia held the scissors with both hands. Before cutting the ribbon, she looked through the glass doors toward the first teaching kitchen, where a tray of focaccia waited beneath a linen cloth. For a moment, she remembered the apron she'd left folded on Belladonna's counter. She remembered believing that one restaurant, one narrow room, and one cruel man represented the limits of her life. Then Raphael had asked, who made the bread? That single question hadn't given her talent. It had simply made her look at what had always been there. Olivia cut the ribbon, and the doors opened. Students, instructors, and guests, entered together, as the academy filled with voices, movement, and the scent of bread beginning to rise. Above the entrance, engraved into pale stone, were the words that defined everything Olivia and Raphael had chosen to build. Talent deserves a place to be seen. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or dazzling light. Sometimes they arrive through one honest question, one person who chooses to look beyond appearances, or one unexpected opportunity that reminds us of the value we've forgotten within ourselves. Olivia already possessed talent, compassion, and strength, but it took someone willing to truly see her before she learned to see those gifts in herself. In our daily lives, we may also meet people whose worth is hidden behind ordinary clothes, difficult circumstances, age, body shape, or a job others consider insignificant. Never underestimate the power of recognizing someone, encouraging them, or simply thanking them for what they do. Your kindness may become the thing they've been hoping for, and perhaps you were placed in their path for that very reason. May everyone watching this story be blessed. May your family stay protected, your heart stay strong, and may you be guided toward the people and opportunities meant for you. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment telling us what lesson you took from Olivia's journey, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories about courage, kindness, and the everyday people who create their own miracles.